So, GW is practically on fire with 9th edition spoilers, and some of them don't even look that terrible. Today, I'm going to be going over what we know so far and what I hope is in store in reference to our very own buggy boys, the Tyranid Swarm. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time to talk about some 9th edition 40k. I imagine a Tyranid preview article is a long way off, so instead of waiting for that, let's just rampantly speculate about some changes in the pipeline and how 9th edition could affect the faction. From the look of the preview so far, GW is angling this edition to focus on big, stompy boys, with both monsters and vehicles getting huge buffs in the new rules. This includes being able to move and shoot with heavy weapons without penalty, firing into melee, and the new obscuring terrain rules that make it infinitely easier to hide large models behind ruins or forested terrain features. Obviously, the line of sight change is specifically huge for Tyranids, and especially our big monsters, as they tend to be physically large and easy to spot, but not all that survivable. Unfortunately, the other changes benefit other factions much more than bugs. Tyranids are pretty muscular, and as such, they don't consider a lot of weapons very heavy, making the ability to move and shoot without penalty disproportionately useful for the heavy armor of other factions, allowing them the same amount of mobility that Tyranids already have to pay for. To make matters worse, our actual heavy weapons are all carried by critters that need to remain stationary anyway to fire effectively, so altogether, this change will simply make other factions' armored vehicles better at playing the hide-and-seek gunfight game than the Tyranids do. While firing into melee is nice for our big bugs that were susceptible to engagement, Tyranids have always been good at clearing wraps, either with psychic powers, neutralizing enemy infantry before it gets to us, or simply offering a hard enough counterpunch with backline melee units so as to make wrapping effectively worthless. Given 9th edition's apparent disdain for melee infantry, I don't see this as a positive change for the Tyranid faction, as it's just as likely that our own infantry get mown down for trying to engage enemy tanks, which in 8th edition was our #1 defense against armored gun lines. And while we're on the topic, let's talk about engaging stuff in melee in general for a moment. Recently, GW spoiled a much-needed overhaul to the Overwatch mechanic, making it a 1 CP strat rather than a universal ability. It's so awesome. It's the best. Overwatch was terrible in 8th edition. It was either an oppressive rule that made some units practically unengageable in melee, or a giant time waster that took 20 minutes of game time to resolve for the 1% chance that you got extremely lucky and ended the game early by killing your opponent's character with a crack grenade without actually having to play to earn it. Now, Overwatch will mostly be reserved for those units that are designed around it, or factions that can abuse it with interesting combos, which on the whole promotes smarter and more tactical play. This is unambiguously a buff to melee units, and especially light infantry that are trying to engage in melee, units like Genestealers or Hormigons. What isn't, however, are the terrain rules. In their articles, GW have spoiled some keywords they recommend for use with various terrain features, specifically ruins. Some examples are heavy cover and the defensible mechanic. The hilariously misnamed heavy cover terrain keyword allows you to benefit from cover in melee as long as the attacker didn't charge that turn. And defensible allows you to either get improved Overwatch or +1 to hit while you're in melee. Also, as a side, can we talk about the heavy cover nomenclature for a second and how absolutely stupid it is? The name implies that it's an improvement to light cover, but the two mechanics are entirely separate with no overlap at all. Why not call them ranged cover and melee cover, or cover and fortifications, or barricaded, or literally anything but heavy cover and light cover? It makes no sense, and it's super confusing. Now, in fairness, most of the time I doubt these rules will actually come into play. If you're charging a unit in cover with the intention of killing it, they'll die without the benefit of heavy cover and before they can get their +1 to hit when they swing back at you. However, if your intention is to aim for wraps, the story could be very different. Because when angling for tri-points, the goal is to limit casualties in the target unit as much as possible, they will most likely benefit from both the +1 to hit over the course of 2 fight phases and the +1 save during the opponent's turn when you're actually angling to kill the unit. The combination of the rules is going to see a lot more of the charging unit dead, with a greater chance that the unit being engaged doesn't die at the end of the second fight phase, which can spell doom if they cannot fall back and re-engage. Approaching the interaction with an 8th edition mindset, it feels much more dangerous to engage into melee, especially into units dug into cover. That said, there is a very real chance that the infantry try-pointing game disappears almost entirely. With blast weapons now hyper-efficient at killing infantry, and infantry units benefiting the least from the new terrain rules, at least as it relates to line of sight and ranged attacks, it seems to me that aggressive infantry units will probably disappear from the game entirely. Outside of their inability to fire into melee, blast weapons don't appear to have any additional drawbacks to compensate for their newfound power level, and we'll probably see them at the same rate that we do in 8th. With a single Thunderfire or Lehman Rust doubling or tripling their expected damage output versus infantry, lists can use them in a dual-purpose role, bringing an answer to massed infantry without having to compromise the integrity of their anti-armor firepower. To make matters worse for light infantry, with Mike Brandt taking over the mission design for the game and bringing his own heavily biased sensibilities to the table, based on GW's preview so far, it appears that objective scoring will move to taking place at the start of each turn rather than at the end, how it currently works. This makes squishy units, such as light infantry, effectively useless when it comes to holding objectives without obscene amounts of cover to hide them, since they will need to survive in control of an objective for an entire battle round. While the rules for the new action mechanic have also yet to be revealed, it's likely that they require a unit to sacrifice their movement in attacks for a battle round as well, most likely making low resilience infantry pretty worthless when it comes to scenario play, and requiring the inclusion of heavier infantry like Tyranid warriors or intercessors to actually remain active in the mission. It remains to be seen how these changes will impact the metagame of 40k, but I have to imagine that massed infantry are in great danger of going the way of the dodo. So with that in mind, what tools do Tyranids need to compete in the new game? With the focus being on big, rolly tanks and stompy monster boys, I'm excited to see that my very favorite dude in the whole game, the not-so-humble Hive Tyrant, is getting real swole. With his ability to shoot while in melee and hide extremely effectively behind obscuring terrain, their cool, big, giant, flashy model isn't such an impediment anymore. I hope we see a bump to their melee stat line to keep them relevant, since Strength 6 really doesn't cut it these days. And maybe a smaller price hike compared to the rest of the line to keep them competitive with other similar multi-role monsters, but I have a feeling the days of dumping 4 Tyrants into a list are returning, and I couldn't be more excited. With Flyrants in mind, I do hope that with these new shooting while in melee rules for monsters and vehicles, we see Flyers become unable to fall back and shoot. It was always really dumb, broken, it made no sense, and most of the worst offenders like Eldari Armor and Riptides can now just shoot into melee anyway. So even though it would represent a debuff to units like Flyrants, I would be willing to accept the trade-off. With the exception of Exocrines, who, with these new rules, may end up as an unstoppable force that will send Tyranids to the highest echelon of competition, and may be the living incarnation of God's power made manifest in a little tiny plastic crab, I'd like to see an overhaul of the other big stompy monsters Tyranids have access to compete with the new meta of powerful tanks. For example, Tyrannofexes are overpriced and inflexible. My hope is that we see a price drop for them, or rules allowing them to move and shoot and still get their ranged attack attributes. The fact that they can't benefit from symbiotic devastation, for example, is utterly flabbergasting to me. Carnifexes have fallen so far from the heady days of 4th edition when they were unkillable gods, and while I like their new role as a spammable monster that's decent in large numbers, they're really bad. They're like really super bad, super duper bad. With points across the game going up 20-ish%, realistically, I'd like them to stay at the same cost they are now in 8th edition. I'd also like to see them be able to advance and shoot their weapons without penalty. That would make them an interesting alternative to the bigger, more static gunbugs, and be an interesting equivalent to the ability to move and shoot that other heavy pieces are receiving. Alternatively, we could see a total overhaul of the datasheet to keep up with the current power level, adding a bunch of wounds and maybe more powerful weapons, but I imagine a points drop is more likely. While I hope our big stompy monsters become more viable in the new edition, I'm not holding out much hope for the survival of existing Tyranid archetypes. With the spoiled 50% cost increase of 4-point chaff infantry, namely Chaos Cultists in the preview article, Termagant and Hormagant swarms will most likely become too expensive to be viable. And while realistically I'm only expecting a 2-point or so increase to Gene Stealers, I'm not sure that the new mechanics will be favorable to aggressive melee units for all of the reasons I've already stated in this video. As we edge slowly closer to 9th edition's release, I'm more and more excited about what this new edition means for the game. With a lower barrier to entry, cleaner rules, and less ambiguity, my hope is that 9th edition will be a new age for competition in 40k. That said, I do have absolutely zero faith that Games Workshop will be able to execute it well, and I expect a lot of poorly written and ill-conceived rules upon release. I'm also deeply concerned about the new mission structure. While I know it will be a vast improvement from the terrible systems of 8th edition, those mission formats were never really used competitively, and their enormous gaping flaws didn't really impact the competitive scene at all. Well, I'm glad that Mike Brandt has been brought onto the team to help GW design better mission rules. The fact that they have effectively killed ITC champions is distressing, to say the least. In my opinion, the Nova format is, well, I mean, it's really bad. It's super bad. It's effectively unplayable for a lot of factions in the game, and especially those who rely on close combat and aggressive play to build a battle point lead early on. The new mission format looks concerningly like Nova, but in the end, we will have to wait and see how it turns out once the full rules shape up upon release to make a final consideration. Anyway, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this kind of rambly style of video. If you're interested in supporting the channel, remember to check out Tactical Tortoise on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, where you can join all of the cool people on screen at supporting the channel and getting all sorts of cool benefits like patron-exclusive videos, early access to T5S2 tournament pods, and some exclusive events as well. Thanks again for watching. Remember to like and subscribe if you want to do all that YouTube stuff. And remember to keep it classy, folks. Happy wargaming!